All right. Hello, everyone. This is Trip, and Phil Clayton is going to get a whole nother computer. He has restarted his computer completely, and then his camera still didn't work, so he's going to get another one to hop on. So, but when he gets in, we will be talking and celebrating the life and thought of John Cobb, who has been extremely important, influential to both of us. He changed my life in a million ways from when I found him in undergrad and didn't know that, the process theology was a thing. And since then, managed to write about him in multiple books, edit a book of a bunch of his unreleased stuff. There we go. Boom. Andrew Schwartz and I got to edit this this past year, and it's a selection of theological writings throughout his career that many of them, one of the cool things about the Center for Process Studies, the research opportunities, if you're into any of it, right, is that there are all these papers and articles and talks that are unpublished, and to spend enough time in Claremont and writing about John Cobb, and you get to have a whole little Dropbox folder full of all your fun unpublished Cobb things. And so when we were gathering for the 50th anniversary for the Center for Process Studies, John Cobb's 97th birthday in Claremont just not too long ago, we surprised him with this volume. Andrew and I debated, sticking stuff in it, but you'll notice that it's thick enough we didn't, there are 22 chapters. All right. So, yeah. But I don't want to start telling too many stories before Phil gets on, but I do know I got messages from Substack when I sent. Look at this! Look at this! A camera working of Philip Clayton. Come on, Phil, this is great. Now, hey Phil, you still got sunlight. There we go. Philip, I can hear your room. I heard you for a second. You can't hear me. This is something. Well, Phil has come off and on. There you go. Let me check with him real quick. Now I hear noise, Phil, right now. Like, I hear noises, Phil. Like your mic came off and on. But yes, so for people,
camera. I'll give you
I can hear you. I can hear you. I can hear you, Phil. So I'm just going to hit. All right. So a couple of people asked about where to start. We'll give Phil a second to figure this out. The if you connect with thinkers, because you get to hear a lot of, because you connect with their story, his theological autobiography, Theological Reminiscence, is let's see, it came out in 2014. It was probably like his 9th last book, because John wrote a whole bunch of last books. But this is his autobiography. It is a great place to start. Also, some of the later books, his book Confessions, tackles a number of different theological themes, and he gets straight to the point. One of my faves as a place to start is Jesus Abba, because, well, he likes to talk about Jesus and such. And there's Abba. So, Phil, is your thing working now?
I'm good. Can you hear me okay?
Yes. Yes.
Awesome.
Well, I had no idea that Satan would try to, you know, ruin the internet today, Phil.
Maybe John's playing with us.
Oh, oh, well, um, yeah, yeah. So here we go. I'm going to make a note as to when you showed up to save myself time later when editing this.
I'm paying you back for being 11 minutes late to class once.
Oh, I'm sure it happened. There was the ride between my house and Claremont was somewhere between 80 and 140 minutes, depending on the time of day. So, all right. Well, thank you all for being here. And thank you, Phil, for finding a whole nother computer. We're here to, it'll be hard not to smile despite how sad I've felt the last few days. Because one of the things that is just genuinely true about John is he resonated warmth when you were in his presence, and it shows back up when you get to talk about him, or even looking at his books. I managed to narrow down the 48 books of his I had to just 19 on my desk currently. So yeah, but Phil, where do you want to begin?
That's a great. Let's just start right there. The presence that he radiated. I first met him in 1981 when Pannenberg was speaking at CST, and I was a Fuller student who thought it was dangerous to get even in the city called Claremont. I'm sure some of my professors wouldn't have approved. But I sat in this auditorium, met him then at the Silver Anniversary Conference in 1998 again. And then he actually wrote a letter when I was at Harvard saying, hey, my chair is open and I'd really like to have you come and apply, and supported that application all the way through. But the first anecdote that comes to mind was David Griffin running the 1998 Silver Anniversary Conference, 25 years of the Center for Process Studies. And Dave was not ironic. So David would walk into a room and tell everyone where they were wrong, even if it was like 2 millimeters from his own position. He was frightening to the doctoral students, as some of you may know. But when there would be a session, so for example, this was the big meeting between the real process theologians and the open theists. And they barely were going to come because they really were not sure that the folks here were Christian at all. And there was a room and 3 people gave papers. The tension was so big in the room that you could cut it with a knife. And the last person spoke. There's a pause. John Cobb sort of gently raised his hand and found himself talking to each of the major disputants and saying, well, do we really disagree this much? Don't we actually both hold this and this and this? And on all central points, don't we actually agree? And by the time that John had sort of questioned and spoken with each of the 3 speakers, there was this sense for the first time, I think, since open theism arose, that they really could work as brothers and sisters with the process folks. That was John Cobb in a single sentence.
Mm-hmm. The first time I met John Cobb, I was an undergrad and won paper contest, so you got to go to AAR SBL, and it was the first year of the Open and Relational Theology group, and I guess I'd met Tom Ward on the internet. I don't somehow, but I wrote a paper basically looking historical exegesis of Jeremiah 18, the potter will image, going, it only takes about 300 years for Christians to never take the rather obvious point that it's a parable about the dynamic relationship of God and the world, and the different possibilities are there, and there's genuine openness of God to human openness, and it's a cooperative picture. And it was looking like Aquinas and Calvin and all these people missed it, and this kind of thing. And so I was so excited. And Tom, we had met on the internet or whatever, and he's
And
like, yeah,
Tom just put something in the chat. So Tom Ward's here.
yes, he says, oh, we're having the first get together for the Open Relational Theology group. And I said, is John Cobb going to be there? And he said, yes. And I was just like, can I meet him? And because in undergrad, when I found process, I read a bunch of his books. I half understood it, but it was like meeting someone who was a Southerner who was deeply pious, both John and I are Southerners with a deep piety. If you say the word God, we think it's whatever was Jesus was showing us, and we like really big questions. And so, like, I picked up that just reading him, and then Tom walks over and introduces me, and then John said, "Well, here's my email. I'd like to talk to you." And then a year later, I go in the summer and take the week-long summer class with him at the Claremont, for the Center for Process Studies and got to have lunch with him each day. And it was just one of those things that you show up. We had a brief conversation at AAR, and he remembered what I was there for, and he was asking me what I was thinking about, and then he just sat and listened, and I just spouted away. Who knows what I said? I've re-listened to things I said to him 15 years ago that were recorded, and I'm a little bit embarrassed, but when you got done, you realized like he genuinely cared about you and the questions that you had, and didn't feel like you had to commute intellectually to be treated seriously.
Yeah.
And a lot of scholars, um, they require a vocab commuting, discipline commuting, all these things. He would cross boundaries and then adopt the space the other person is and try to learn and take it seriously. And that kind of attentiveness
Yeah. Well, it was amazing. I saw
there
him do
throughout.
that over and over and over again. So there'd be a doctoral student or candidate who was maybe not quite so strong, and he'd show up at John's house at 11 for a meeting, and John would give him an entire hour, and then he'd say, "Look, I'm going to lunch. Why don't you come? I'll treat you to lunch at Pilgrim Place." And he'd have him there at the table with the luminaries of retired theologians who were in the room. I remember once we talked about Pannenberg because I came pretty soon after the time with Pannenberg. And he said, "Well, I had to make a decision. Pannenberg and I were together in 1961 in Mannheim, Karlsruhe on the Rhine. And I recognized he was so brilliant. He just knew everything. So Pannenberg became this solo author, volume after volume. But John said, I just wasn't that smart. So I realized I need to foster a whole group of students who are working together on these questions. And together we get to the point of breakthroughs." And he said that throughout his career and lived it in the way that he would draw others into the discussion as well.
Yeah. One of the moments that came back just thinking about John and going through emails and listening to us talk was the first. We had just moved to California, so Alicia and I had moved. Elgin, our now 17-year-old, 6 months old, and when we get there, he had sent a letter to the house we were moving into. When I had visited and done like the visiting the churches thing, and the minister wanted to go have lunch with John. So I'm like, I'm up for this job. He wants to have lunch with you. So we go have lunch with him. And I guess he had gotten the address to the house we were going to be moving into. So we get there, and there's a note from John and Jean inviting Alicia, Elgin, and I to lunch. So we had only been there a few weeks, and we go out to Claremont and go have lunch with them. And he had talked about, oh, Gene loves the different Southern breads, right? So I'm like, well, I'm going to bring banana nut bread because I know how to do that. And from that time on, anytime we interacted, he and Gene for years they didn't just talk to me; they asked about family.
Yeah.
They picked up those relationships. If early on, especially when Gene's health was better, if I showed up, there was sweet tea because she was like, "Oh, one of the Southern kids is coming over."
Yeah. Yeah.
And they had that kind of hospitality and I was like, "Oh man, I'm special." Then I find out he got an email from a person that just heard him on the podcast and said, "I heard you on Homebrewed Christianity, and I went and read your book, and I really liked it, and I was coming through town, and I just thought it would be cool to get you to sign the book." Turns out John just invites everyone for lunch because he's that nice. And so then I get this email from a podcast listener I've never met in life. And he's like, "Look, I had lunch with John Cobb and Rosemary Radford Ruther showed up."
Yeah. Sitting at the table.
And if your reputation is you go out of your way to have lunch and listen to people and care and just happen to be super brilliant, then,
So the thing
it's a
is, a
beautiful
lot of
life.
a lot of people do that in a superficial way. Think, oh, great to see you. And it doesn't really get through. But John had a way of saying the things to you with utter sincerity that were life changing. And I watched him do that over and over again. I remember your face when, forget which conference it was. It was probably before the golden anniversary last in 2023. And John said, so this is Trip Fuller. I think he's the most significant Christian theologian for reaching out and reaching large numbers of people. And I could see that the things he was saying about you were exactly what you take your calling to be. How could somebody do that over and over and over again? I mean, I wanted to stay at Harvard, but the letter John wrote so picked up the things that I wanted to achieve in my career that I felt I got to take this seriously.
Yeah. So, um, I one of the questions I thought it would be fun to start with, and kind of see where it goes is how John, I think he pioneers what the vocation of a Christian theologian looks like, in our current century. Like when we think of what the definition of being a theologian, what that vocation looks like as a scholar and an intellectual, that contrast just between him and Pannenberg, someone both of us deeply appreciate. You see that contrast, but then there's the relationship side. But everything that he and David did at the Center for Process Studies and across different disciplines, the integration of deep ethical commitments to constructive work in theology and philosophy and such. I don't even remember which conference it was. It was one of the earlier ones when I first got to Claremont. But Catherine made the suggestion when, that big group of theologians were there, that John had modeled what being a theologian and our contemporary century looks like. And people just kind of nodded like, this is obvious. And so I thought it would be fun to kind of name different things about John as to why so many of his peers, the generation or two younger than him, when they're all gathered, 40 different theologians teaching systematic at all these different schools, Catherine makes a suggestion, and it was probably the only uncontested thing I heard that entire entire gathering.
So here's an example of that, living that vocation. So John takes on the most naughty questions of theology in the 1960s, early 70s, developing his voice as a process theologian, invites David Griffin in to co-found the Center for Process Studies. But look at the way he moves through books. So let's go back to Charles Birch in 1981, a biologist, The Liberation of Life from the Cell to the Community. Heavy duty Darwin and theology, right? He's dialoguing with Buddhists at the same time who are saying, I've never heard a Christian who seemed to understand the message of Buddhism as deeply as John does. And then here's the next book, Praying for Jennifer, 1985.
A
Talking
beautiful
about
book.
a person dying of cancer and why we pray and what it means to pray. Then he's back with Herman Daly for the common good, redirecting the economy toward community environment, etc., winning a major prize for that one. And then Can Christ Become Good News Again? One of the next books afterwards, Lay Theology, Grace and Responsibility, which I've taught multiple times. And then back to The Earthist Challenge to Economism. Like, how can one person move from these deeply intellectual integrative topics to basic pastoral theology?
Mm-hmm. And there was that big shift early in his career when he, I can't remember exactly how the story goes, but Cliff raises the question of the environmental crisis to him.
Tell them who Cliff is.
His son. Right. This is one of those things that, not every dad reorients their career because their kid challenged them. But Cliff, his son, raises the question of the ecological crisis, and John seeks it out. And this is way early, right? He ends up writing one of the first eco-philosophy books ever. So, it wasn't like all of the guild members are nodding their heads going, yeah, this is a very integrated challenge. We have to have a whole new way of relating as a
Wait,
species.
let's just be a little stronger there. This book in 1971, Is It Too Late? A Theology of Ecology, is said by many people to be the founding text for eco-theology.
There you
His
go.
response to his son saying, hey, Dad, why don't you think about this topic? Oh, well, I'll found a 50-year discussion called eco-theology.
And one of the things about that is, and he had a couple different ways of saying it, but he just said, that to be a Christian theologian is to take what happened in Jesus and everything God gave you to wrestle with the most important questions.
Yeah.
And one of the things that you see, whether it's right engaging with Herman Daly and developing a non-accelerating growth model of the economy, or addressing the ecological crisis, or the book that came out, Back to Darwin, right, of thinking about biology after the end of the neo-Darwinian synthesis and such. And in all these places, you can see the way that vocation takes shape, either crossing intellectual disciplines, or addressing even the production of knowledge or the life of the church, in critiques of the university and the church, to addressing ethical challenges. And throughout it, one of the things that shows up reading is autobiography, and in some of the later books like Confessions or Salvation, is you see how there are these like breakthrough moments where a question he thinks has to be addressed if you're going to say you're a disciple of Jesus, and then he just kind of goes and does it. But
Yeah.
when you hear it, when you read his own narrative, um, there's a kind of continuity of the engine the entire time, even if you were just reading the books like you were. You're like, so you wrote an 80-page book for small groups at a church to discuss
Yeah.
prayer and the
Yeah.
problem of evil right after you won a economics book award. You know, that he can shift gears quick.
Yeah. He was fearless. That's something that comes to mind. I just saw the comment of Ben Chicka comment in the comment section, who points out that it doesn't matter what your title was, how well you're known. But when there was something that needed to be done, John just did it. And I never heard him say, "Oh gosh, I don't know whether I'm good enough. What if I fail?" That kind of self-questioning that for most of us is a part of living didn't occur to John. He systemically said, "I'm just a humble guy from the South who's living out the pious Christianity I inherited, and the sense that Jesus is about transforming the world." And to have him, he gave the keynote address at UCC National Meeting once, and he said, "Yeah, so I'm really looking for the salvation of the world," he said to this group of fairly liberal pastors. And there was a kind of audible intake of breath. And he said, "Yeah, and the salvation of the world is to make sure that the world doesn't kill, we don't kill the world through our greed, through our economic systems, or through anti-ecological behavior." And there was no point where he seemed to pull his punch at all. Just in a gentle, straightforward way, said what he thought was true.
Yeah. Yeah, I was UCC clergy at that time in LA. So I was quite thrilled. And but the
Right.
part right before he did that, the best part is he goes, well, a lot of mainline Protestant denominations have another 10 or so years they're going to waste coming to grips with the fact that God loves everyone and all their lives are worth celebrating. And luckily, he starts with, it is just the compliment you give to the UCC there, like, and y'all have been advocating all the way through the Prop 8 and everything, and you don't have to fight about inclusion anymore.
Yeah.
And so now I would like you to join me in working for the salvation of the world.
It was perfect. It was perfect. He had a way, he could only do that because he could say something that was so startling that most people would be afraid to say it at all, with a kind of gentleness. And one of my most personal moments with John was 2009. I'd set up a national discussion forum on faith and the future of the planet. We had speakers from multiple religions come in, some by Zoom, some directly. And it was John's turn to speak, and he was giving a talk to a packed room, and said, this, people aren't realizing it, but this climate crisis is larger than we imagine. I mean, this is a kind of climate that could kill millions of people. And I remember somehow so blind to that in 2008, 2009, that I spoke up right in the middle of the lecture. I said, wait, John, millions of people. He said, with utter gentleness and not even raising his voice, hundreds of millions, if not billions. Now, I walked out the door and around campus that night for half an hour and realized, well, I got to change my career because that's so important. If he had dramatized it, I probably wouldn't have paid attention. But I'll never forget that just straight statement of fact. And that was so much more effective.
Hmm. So what when you think of the different times, be it book projects that after you got to Claremont or ones before, are there uh, particular text or maybe or gatherings or stuff that come to mind as like places where John as nerd was pumping the gas,
Yeah.
getting going, where you're like, that is a that captures either the inside or the text or the conference. Like this captures what John as nerd like loves to do.
Yeah. What was so interesting is he didn't jump into the debates like these over-eager doctoral students who just wanted to fight over every topic. We were with Joe Bracken once in the house of, she was at the time director uh, of Process and Faith, Janine Sledham. Now she runs Process Century Press. And people started arguing about various minutiae of the differences between John and David Griffin. He didn't seem like he really wanted to engage. But when they said, "Oh, John, what do you say?" Then we had this perfectly formed 3-paragraph answer about why one had to interpret Whitehead this way and why David probably hadn't understood that one correctly. Uh, but at other times, when the rubber met the road, when somebody had to come through and get the task done, John did it. So the book that came out is Back to Darwin was based on the third of 3 Templeton funded meetings on biology. And frankly, I guess I can say this now because John's not around, it hadn't gone very well. So yeah, there you go. There were biologists who were uncompromisingly reductionist neo-Darwinian. There were dualists in the room. They hadn't really congealed. And when he said, "Do you think we have a volume here, a collection?" I said, "I don't think so. I don't see the agreement." And so, in his gentle way, he never came back and said, "Oh, please, I'm already publishing 3 books right now." And he went away and asked a couple of us to change our chapter in a certain way. I had to write a second chapter. And then what John did is he wrote these massive introductions to each part. Is you can see it in the book over and over again. He sought feedback from a number of us, made them better and better. And I would say that when that book finally came out, it was a powerful statement on how to bring Christianity together with the most rigorous evolutionary biology of our day. Nobody realizes what an incredible intellectual achievement that was. Fairly late in his career. I think he'd been retired 8 or 9, 10 years by then. But he sat down and built that bridge, which, to be honest, none of the rest of us in the room did.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And by the way, if people are interested in reading it, you can actually just read all of his prefaces straight through and then decide which chapters you want to hop in.
That's right.
And when you do, you'll realize that it could have just been a 150-page book by John Cobb in it.
When I listen to people who talk about someone they knew really well who's just passed, I sometimes think, are they really being honest? And I almost want to hear, like, was he human? Like, was always right? And so I wanted to bring in one of the frustrating sides of John, who's my major mentor after Pannenberg. And so, for example, when it came to the conference, in 2010 he decided, I need to do a global conference. It's going to be, he said, I'm going to call it um, Seizing an Alternative Toward an Ecological Civilization. And Cliff said, "Dad, that's a terrible title. You can't do that." And there was a fight they had for several months, but John just wouldn't back down from that one. And then he approached each of his kids and he said, "You're all in your 50s, so I'd like to give away your inheritance. I've been holding this money for you. I want to take all that money and just use it on a single conference of 4 days." And I guess all of the kids said yes, but I could imagine there'd be some frustration, like, there goes Dad again, like giving away the house. And so we invested, I guess I can say it out loud now, over $900,000 in this conference, brought in 230 Chinese guests, people representing the global South, and just would not back down from this concept of laying out the entire waterfront of what it would mean for humans, for him, motivated as a Christian theologian, for us to turn away from a consumption-based economy and lifestyle to an ecological civilization. There's both something inspiring and something incredibly frustrating about a guy who, with his gentle presence, just doesn't budge.
Hmm. He's like the puppy everyone knows is like really cute, and they just love him, and they're like, "This is the nicest dog you've ever seen." And then like once it like bites down on its toy, it,
Yeah,
you're not getting it out of you're not getting it out of the dog's mouth. You can
yeah,
pick it up and move it around. And even some of his descriptions of when he has a question uh, that irritated him. One of the earliest interviews I did with him, I said, "So when you were in graduate school, what was the question that frustrated you so much that you had to know you had the best answer when you were talking to your peers?" And he said, "I wanted to know if there's actually the possibility of doing theology without it being shaped by philosophy."
hmm,
And so when you look at which the his dissertation is what looked at. So he looked at different existentialist philosophers, natural theologians, existentialist theology, natural theology, and then like Barth and
yeah.
Bruner from the neo-orthodox. But it's uh, living options in Protestant theology. Um, and he said when we were talking about it, he goes, and I was like, "Well, what was your answer? Obviously, the next book you write is a Christian natural theology." He goes, "Yes, and I think that's the only real answer for a Methodist, and probably an Episcopalian and Catholic. But if you are Reformed or Lutheran, you could have integrity and manage to avoid doing philosophy." and and if you're a nerd, you understand why around the nature of the gospel and all those kinds of things. But he said, I don't think anyone could have done it better than Bart, and I find it lacking. And so and he said, so I got done doing that, and that was my justification. So then I wrote a Christian natural theology. And when to go, like, if this is what we need to do, then I need to do this. And then I said, so what'd you do next? And he goes, well, uh, I wrote that book, and then a lot of Christians really they were glad that I talked about science and the question of evil and stuff. But they're like, what does that have to do with the Christian God? So I wrote God in the World. Um,
Which is a brilliant book, by the way.
it is, and then he goes, and then some of the neo-orthodox theologians were just said you didn't talk enough about Jesus. So I wrote another book on Jesus, Christ in a Pluralistic Age, right? And what was fascinating, asking him questions about his career, is that when that question he wouldn't let go of uh, was one, because he's like, I experienced the divine, and I found Jesus' vision of Abba so compelling. It was just sad. It was just sad to think the only way you would get around to it is if you just happen to learn the right language game, or you
Mm.
happen to be born in the right place. If Abba's really the one good God, wouldn't that very God be showing up in every moment to all God's people in all these different places? And so the like the drive that
Yeah.
led him to do it, and then pursued on out, right? Was both this, it was existentially meaningful to him. Like, can I still believe in God and treasure these experiences? And then he kept hearing from other people, and then, it kind of builds out.
So
So,
what I'm hearing is John Cobb was a combination of a willingness to change, to have his research program be led by others. I mean, it was Buddhists coming to him and saying, "Hey, you were born and grew up in Japan. Maybe you can help us build the bridge." That led to his multi-year involvement with Buddhism. Um, or as Tom Orr just said in the chat, John told me that I shouldn't title my book "God Can't." He later told me he was wrong about that. And he would have been just as egoless when he told Tom, don't use the title, as when he told Tom, I was wrong. And yet at the same time, you couldn't budge the guy. He'd never just kind of make you happy by saying what you wanted to hear. I think that's the frustration, these two sides. In a sense, nobody really swayed him. That deep pietism and that sense that God is about the transformation of the world were there from, early childhood. And on the other hand, when somebody gives him new evidence, he's willing to do something different.
I found a passage near the end of his autobiography where earlier in the last chapter he realized just how much his piety had shaped his whole academic career, and then he says this: "I'm confessionally and unapologetically Jesus-centric.
Yeah.
My Jesus-centrism is the claim that today the most needed understanding of who we are, where we stand, and what is needed comes from viewing the whole from this center. I can state the argument briefly. We live in a moment of history that could be its last. Continuation of history depends on how we respond to terrible threats. Assuming some survive, how this remnant reconstitute itself is of enormous importance. Thus far, the efforts of historically oriented people have been to respond to the crisis with the already accepted cultural values and institutions. These efforts have failed. We need an approach that appeals beyond what is now culturally acceptable to a higher authority than dominant experts. It must be countercultural. It must look at reality from the bottom rather than from the top down." And then he proceeds to just describe how the concept of God became more defined through the life of Israel and to the person of Jesus, and then gets derailed. And he said, and he gives an aside to go, what's getting itself done in the Christ is not a possession of Christianity or even of Jesus, because Jesus couldn't have been the Christ without the Syrophoenician woman, someone that expanded Jesus's own boundaries in it. And so he said, so then he goes, I see Jesus as the fulfillment of the prophetic tradition, the one through whom entered into the wider stream of history. And this transformation of the prophetic tradition is one that all human beings may share, and perhaps Christians may need to relearn it by attending to the the wisdom of a Hindu such as Gandhi. Like, it is such a, this is what he means by Jesus centric. And then and then he goes, then he gives this riff on, it would be nice to if the followers of Jesus thought the love of enemy was something worth preserving. And then he goes, but one thing I could still say is that in the most literal sense, every fleshly entity enfleshes or incarnates God. But I could also make a stronger claim about exactly how God was present in Jesus. And that's mattered to me the entire time.
Yeah. Yeah.
But he says it in this way, right? Like, I would like to stay what's at my center so I can relate to the whole.
Yeah.
And so he does something that a lot of our peers have trouble doing. Some like preserve a deep Jesus center, and then it ultimately sets up boundaries where there's some definition of how you understand God in Christ that creates an in and out, or some access or not to salvation, or you go through all the ways that putting Christ at the center can create boundaries. And then others, in order to expand the boundaries, decenter the Jesus centrism that John has. And John, throughout his career, has this sense of resisting relativism and absolutism, and letting the energy of the one Jesus called Abba shape his own life and reflection.
And it's really interesting because a lot of us in Emergent Church and in the discussion today aren't quite sure where we stand. Say that we had a particular conservative background that didn't hold for us and we needed to find something else. And it gives us a kind of tenuousness. We realize that something depends on the conceptual answers we give, or we're not going to make it. And John never needed that. That's how I understood what you just said. There was just a certainty at the heart of it, a piety that wouldn't let go. You're not unlike that, Trip. And so he didn't have to have words for it. And not having words, he would say, well, let's just explore this. Let's see where it takes us, with a kind of confidence that wouldn't let go. And that is really hard to emulate, really hard to learn. If it isn't sort of given to you, we might say by grace.
Mhm. Yeah, oh man, I didn't mark that passage, but in towards the end of Structures of Christian Existence, which is really kind of like his first book that took seriously the diversity of wisdom traditions and not just wisdom traditions, because even philosophical schools of thought are in it, right? Like Stoicism and these kinds of things. But because he was looking at kind of different structures of existence, very similar forms of life and such. Uh, but at the end of it, when he's talking about the nature of love and the Christian structure of existence and what love looks like in it, it's similar to what you know from that passage I read, where there's this enemy love, and it's in and he spends time where the dialectic of love for the Christian, and he says, well, at least in theory, like he's not going to say like we do this all the time, is one that's transfixed by a deep intimacy about all your particularities, that every particular thing about you is held in the gaze of Abba's love.
Yeah.
And that other side of that dialectic is that same tender care that we come to trust through the words of Jesus, the experience of the one he calls Abba, is true of our enemy. And when Christians use the word love, it is always a promissory note
Mm,
because no one has got there yet. And so for Christians, love and grace are always intermingled,
yeah.
because to even conceive of that kind of intimate love for oneself is already a gift of grace. And it's one of these passages where it's just like where he's doing his normal analysis of this or this, and then you can just see this moment of
Yeah.
this matters to me, so I'm just going to go ahead and tell it to you.
What underlies? Yep. All right. So let's take on a couple of the hard questions before we run out of time. So Whitehead and Christian theology, and this came up. This is a little intense, but it came up. I was having a discussion with a philosophical theologian earlier today, fairly open-minded, who said, "So there's this big debate. Whitehead teaches an objective immortality, so every moment of our existence is forever perfectly perceived in the emerging consequent nature of God." And then Margie Suhaki, the second holder of the Ingram chair, said no. In the End of Evil, she said there's a subjective immortality that's essential. And using a kind of panentheistic framework, she had to place it with the spirit of God as a substratum, not individual bodies. We're connected with each other, but our own subjective consciousness is a part of that immortal state. In the message that Andrew Schwartz sent out on, it was Friday around noon, I think, last week, that John had died. He quoted John on, I wonder if we could find the quote, on a couple of the things John said about what he thought about after his death, the way that he would live on. If you look at the things that he actually endorsed, they were all actually a part of Whiteheadian objective immortality. He never endorsed Marjorie's position that a subjective awareness, our own, our unique consciousness, continues after death. We continue in and through other people and their memories of ourselves. And that's one of those tensions of Whitehead and John Cobb as a pious Christian that I've found it hard to understand.
He talks about it in he gave a lecture in 87 at Harvard that was titled The Resurrection of the Soul,
Mm-hmm.
because he rarely would talk about this in his academic text, and he almost always was like, well, Whitehead and Hartshorne said this, Marjorie said this. um but they are one of the, I thought you might ask about this, so here's the line. He said, in our relation to God, there's no distinction of body and soul. Every cellular event in our bodies lives on in God, just as does every personal experience.
Mm-hmm.
Here, too, we can speak of the resurrection of the soul. But in this ultimate case, the resurrection of the soul and the resurrection of the body are united. It is in the wholeness of our psychosomatic being that we live forever in God.
Okay, let's dig into that, right? Um, Whitehead doesn't have the position that there's some substratum like a soul that ties together all the moments, all the actual occasions. They just exist, right? And they are physical and mental both. In God, all are preserved. And so, in a sense, John's holding a very traditional view when he says that mind and body shouldn't be separated. Every moment, whether physical or mental prehension, is saved. It's unified by and in God. Now, Marjorie speaks to a piety that many of us share. We have a sense that our subjective awareness is the core of who we are, and for it not to be retained would be a loss. And John just isn't worried about that tendency. It's almost like he doesn't hear our anxiety that our own awareness wouldn't be present as a subjective reality after death. And he just sticks with the Whiteheadian position all the way through.
Well, what's funny is he said um one of the times I talked to him about this, he said something like, "Well, and immortality is a different question than life beyond death. I'm pretty optimistic that this, like, essentially the seat of one's subjectivity isn't the last word, at least for everyone. Otherwise, how would the disciples encounter Jesus?" And then goes into all these other things. And then he goes, uh, "Well, the longer I've lived, I've wondered exactly how enjoyable it would be to inherit my subjectivity as something so dear and precious when I, essentially before him would be prehending the fullness of the divine life." And
Yeah.
so he, in that essay, he talks about the possibility of experiencing the differentiation of self in ways after one's death.
Mm-hmm.
But that it would just have some necessarily immortal status like a soul. He's like, that's kind of nuts. But
I don't
if
know. I don't know. I think it's harder than that. I mean, Matt says it really well in the chat. Matt says, Phil, might we still live after death in the life of the consequent nature, not as we were perhaps, but as God feels us? I think that
Mhm.
really was John Cobb's position.
Yeah,
And
because he talks
Cobb
about
points out Dave
the
Ray Griffin, he thinks, is the most consistent, advocating for life after death as subjective experience. A huge difference between the two of them that these two, Matt and Tom, point out in the chat that probably isn't seen very often.
yeah, the last section, which is in that essay, Resurrection of the Soul. um it is literally the last 4 paragraphs where he tells you what he thinks about any of this after doing everything that you would think a process person explaining to people at Harvard that are interested what a process person might think.
Yeah.
That's when he gets to that part.
So typical John.
Yeah. So, um, and and I would say he was in his more practical works or pastoral works, he recognized the future, the if there was no future subjectivity for experiences of deep injustice and suffering was a bigger problem than his own, which is the starting point for Marjorie's own
Yeah. The end of
reflection
evil.
on the end of evil.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, I think we should take on a hard question, a personal question, a revealing question. What is something in John that is a calling to be a kind of person that we aren't normally, that we don't do easily? And it's that we've already mentioned things like this incredible affirmation, not just in a subjective way of the people around him, but in that deep, almost, I'll say, life transformative way. But there are things that John did that would be really hard to emulate. And I'll mention one. Mary Daly, as she came out as the most radical and began to separate from her Roman Catholic Christianity, she would hold talks, and the rule was that males had to sit in the last 2 rows and were not allowed to speak. So 1 Corinthians 14, reverse now for the men. And so Mark C. Taylor was placed in the back row, and he was irate, and he was standing up and gesticulating and saying, "This is wrong. This is continuing the injustice in the opposite direction is not the way to do it." And finally, they got him silenced, and he sat in the back row, just muttering under his breath. And then she gave her talk, and then the panel walked onto the stage, all women, of course, and John Cobb. So John Cobb was on the platform as a part of helping Mary Daly find the words that she was looking for as a radical feminist lesbian theologian. And the rest of the males were silent in the back. There is such a complete, John was a man without guile, we say. And that's just true. No ego, no need to prove himself, no insecurity. He was just there to help the women theologians find their voices in their own terms. And he was assisting from the front.
Yeah.
That's hard to do. We both would have been in the back 2 rows yelling.
Well, I wouldn't have yelled because
I know you would
John was in the room, and it would have gotten me in trouble. I would have just tweeted about it. One of the things that getting to see John up close winning Claremont that really has continued to shape me was the one class where I got to take with him. One of my closest friends there was a Orthodox priest who decided to audit this class while working on his dissertation because I had said amazing things about John Cobb for the last 2 years. And, John's teaching, so come see what happens. And I don't realize that he ended up reaching out to John. They talked, right? Like, and months later, after it was one of those like week-long intensive type things, we were talking, and he said, "Now, Trip, I need to tell you this. John is indeed a heretic. But he is closer to Jesus than anyone else on faculty." And so I asked why, and he had messaged John. He came over, he heard him, and then when he missed something, John reached out, and he had a thing with his family, and then John checked on him and prayed with him, and like was just sitting there in that space. And then one of the other students that did the week-long intensive was a militantly materialist kind who had the very same kind of experience with John, where he's like, I don't really believe in God, but if I did, I would do the John Cobb version because it inspires these beautiful things in his life. And he's not even scared of any of the data about this.
Right,
and he goes on. And that individual now, years later, is like much more open spiritually in places. And he's like, it wouldn't have happened without John. And so one of the things that I noticed in that is that temptation when you first show up in graduate school, especially if you come from the South and then show up in Claremont, is like, what do you do with your very preacher's kid in the South piety? And John kept his in John's way, and in being able to be present with people, it opened the door in ways for those individual stories in ways that it wouldn't if you use the academic distancing maneuver, where everything you say is you're not going to make declarative statements. You're not going to do it in an existentially toned way. You'll always be parsing. You might just play the character of who you're reading in class. You do all these kinds of things.
Yeah.
John had some way of being fully himself and fully attentive to the students that it enabled people to end up sharing with him not just their ideas, but where they were in life.
Yeah.
And they knew that he would take it seriously. And I've worked hard at doing that, especially in academic spaces, and the number of people who, like anytime someone reaches out where we have very little in common, but they want to talk to me about processing an experience or something they were thinking, I always think like, I want to keep doing that because that was something I saw John do with students and with peers. And it seems beautiful, especially in a place where the places we talk about truth the most are often the ones we posture the most.
Mm-hmm.
And by the time I met John, he didn't need a posture anymore if he ever did. So it was just
himself. It makes
himself.
me wonder whether he ever did. And that leads to, I guess, all the reflection over these last days after John's death has led me to, it's a confession, I think. I mean, I've had amazing opportunity over the last decades to meet most and spend time with and get to know most of the theologians the major theologians that we read. And in each case, I admire them incredibly. I know I couldn't match their performance in this or that area, but they all make sense somehow. Like, I can understand what made Wolfhard Pannenberg the one he was, or why Jürgen Moltmann, I mean, remember the show we did on him not too long ago, was so jovial and pastoral to Latin American liberation theologians as a whole. At the same time that the Congregation of Faith was negative and condemnatory. With every other person, I understand them as a person and as a theologian, and the connection of those two, and could say, well, yes, if I had that background or if I was that person, that makes sense to me. But it's really hard to comprehend how John Cobb could go through life on the platforms, the places he spoke, the discussions he had, from the stage with Mary Daly to being invited by the vice president of China for 2 full days of private conversation. The guy just wanted to listen to John and his views on the world and ecological civilization. Imagine a Christian theologian guiding the government of China. When we did podcasts at one of the eco forums a few summers ago, the ones with John had over 12 million downloads for each of his short segments that we put out. That's the one person of all the theologians I know, I have trouble comprehending how he could be that way. He come back and call me and say, yeah, I seem to be an icon across China. It's kind of strange to find oneself suddenly an icon. Not a hint of ego. It isn't sort of false humility. It's just like, is that interesting? How that, and maybe somebody who's listening will be able to just put all those pieces together and say, oh yeah, we understand John just as well as we understand, Catherine Keller or other Keith Ward, but I don't.
One of the things I appreciated about John was after the first or second time we did something together, he said, well, you understand the internet a lot more than me. And so anytime you want to do something on the internet, just let me know. And so he would say yes to things, be it or like showing up at a brewery and
the
doing
guy
a
who never drank, right?
Yeah, I know. I kept telling him, I was like, now, John, I'm just telling you, I would come back to Claremont if you just want to get loaded once. And he just look at me. See, Tom Ward's in the chat. Now that he got axed by the Nazarenes, I'm just waiting for the text. Just waiting for the text. He's not in the Nazarenes anymore. But the
Is that a public dare trip?
Yeah. The I was like, I'm renting an additional room at AAR, and I think it'd be fun to have 3 JCs at once. Right? And it was him and just Catherine Keller and Jack Caputo. Or he spoke at the First Theology Beer Camp or whatever. But my favorite was we connected. He checked in not long after I got to Edinburgh, and it was right before lockdown. And he said, I'd love to figure out a way I can support you while you're there, this kind of thing. And I said, John, what if we do an online class, reading process and reality? Because I bet no one's ever had a class with over 1,000 people in it to read process and reality. But I'm pretty sure I can get people there, and then you just do your thing. And he goes, okay, but I've read this book a lot, Trip. I don't think this is that hard to do. I think I'll be fine, and it'd be fun to read it along with you. And I just said, John, if you want to know what is the circumstance where Trip feels like he should contribute as little as possible to the conversation, it's when I'm recording for indefinite use later.
Yeah.
You explaining process and reality. I was like, I don't need you to correct me in front of 1,000 people. I just want you to do it. And so he goes, okay. And so it was one of the most fun experiences. because we would get on, and he would have told us, oh, here's the sections. We would get on and talk for a bit, and I would have taken all the emails people sent in with questions and organize it by topics, right?
Yeah.
And then go like, what's the most generic way to ask a question that 10 people asked in weird ways? And he would say, well, what are those topics? Okay. All right, that'll work. And he just had his copy of Process and Reality there and a post-it note. I realize he turns like, because Richard Livingston's helping him with the tech stuff, sitting there, and I see it's like this on the front. And I was like, what's that? And he goes, oh, that's my talk.
Yeah, right.
And I just realized that there's familiarity with Process and Reality, and then there is a post-it note with 5 words on it that involved him breaking down each element of prehension, and where with the kind of detail where he goes, and I believe that's on page. It was one of those times where you just are watching him cook, and then going, he's 95 years old. How in the world is this happening?
Yeah.
Like, what's the circumstance where you have that available to you?
But Trip,
It's like when you finish your qualifying exam.
It wasn't just Process and Reality, though. He was brilliant there. But time and time again in his 90s, I watched him stand up at a podium with no notes, give a 45-minute, 7-point talk without missing a single one of the points, and then move on to answer questions. I mean, a lot of us couldn't do that at 22. By the way, you got a lot of people in the chat who are in that online class on Process and Reality. I just saw Brian done.
Oh yeah, and if if people want to check it out, then go to theologyclass.com. It's on there, along with our intro to process theology class, which now imagine talking one of the greatest living theologians into doing a class with you, and you're like, I want to do intro to process theology. And then he said, well, Trip, what topic should I do? And I'm like, John, why? I have my favorites. If you just are like, give you topics that Trip wants you to talk about. And then he goes, no, what would be the most important topics for people that would be interested in if theology is worth doing anything anymore? And I was like, I don't know. He goes, well, then could you just ask them? And so he had me send an email out, and then whatever the 6 biggest questions people had that made them forget, it was like, what is the question that keeps you from having the animated faith you want? Or it was like phrased in a very John way, where it's like, I don't want to know your intellectual question. What's the question where if you had a better way of thinking about it, you would be more engaged in the world, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And then he just took those, and then he shows up with his post-it note and does his thing. But like if I actually am very confident, if I asked Philip Clayton to do an intro to theology class with me, I would get an email with an outline.
Yeah,
and it would be rather detailed. And then you would probably say, Trip, I'll try to keep things short so I can take questions at the end to go where they want to go. But the agenda, you would have already thought about, here's how we're going to organize it. Here are the questions, got to do it. And John was just like, well, if we could find out what is the most challenging question for them, I will just build it around that. And I'm like,
yeah. And you'd expect a person who did that to struggle. Like, okay, let's try to bring this piece together and this piece together with a kind of intellectual tension, a flexing of the intellectual muscles to do it. But I never saw him break a sweat. He never seemed, well, I don't quite know how to fit this and this together. It's just, he kind of lays it out and it comes out, which actually, I think we should say this clearly and honestly, there's something otherworldly about that can be frustrating. I'll say this as his, 18-year, 20-year colleague. When he would say, so Philip found a global organization to promote ecological civilization around the world. All right, I'll go for it. And then, you'd say, you get launched into this, you're looking for money, you're trying to make an impact in China and Germany and Latin America and Africa. And then John would say, well, yeah, I'm not really good at running things. So, if you want me to sit on the board, I will, but I really don't know anything about that stuff. And I would talk to his staff from over the years, they shall remain unnamed, about the incredible frustration to have somebody so otherworldly look them in the eyes and say, please do this. Please do a silver anniversary conference or whichever it is. and then not really be able to do those kinds of practical details. That there was a sense that you were dealing with somebody from another world sometimes.
The okay, I want to know, what is your favorite intellectual argument that you've had over the years with John? Because I can think of a few you've brought up multiple times, but what's the one where every time this subject comes up in one of your ears, whispering is going to be John, just reminding you that, Phil, you almost figured it out?
I've tried gently, and I've tried as a frontal assault to broaden the sphere of process thinkers that John would utilize, that one would utilize in doing a process-oriented Christian theology. So we had a monthly lecture series at the Center for Process Studies, which was attended by 35, 40 people when I first arrived at Claremont School of Theology and began teaching there in fall of 2003. And so I would never speak on Whitehead, which is what almost everybody did, but I would do Samuel Alexander, or what is the notion of durée, of duration, right, in Bergson, and try to show that they brought dimensions to the overall process discussion that made it stronger. I mean, I'd written on Schelling and Hegel and Whitehead and tried to bring in those nuances. Something of the German idealist tradition could be helpful here. And I never got John to put any other process thinker close to the level of Whitehead. They weren't even on the same playing field as, like, well, those are the amateurs, and then here we've got the World Cup. And we would come back to that in 1,000 ways. The nature of God, God's eternality, God's presence, what is the centrality of a human being, what makes the dominant actual occasion. And I never got an inch of movement on him. And we did come back to it for many years.
I'll see if you remember this. It was on this topic. I can't even remember who the guest was, but John was part of whatever the event was, but it was a philosophy of mind related thing. And John's response began with all William James related lines. And you said in your question, John, you point out like that he was engaging William James as the process thinker in this. And John's response was, well, no, he's pretty good. And
which is an insult, right? It's
right.
both positive and like
you were
for a
like
4-year-old. He runs around the soccer field pretty well.
Yeah, it was just like, well, he was pretty good. Which was suddenly, I was just going to give a response on behalf of Whitehead, but I decided to mix it up a little bit.
Yeah.
Well, he was pretty good.
So I always had the sense that maybe my more mystical side, that the words that we find from philosophers don't completely capture Jesus, don't completely capture God's self-revelation, that process. And so for me to be a pluralist in philosophical and theological resources and others is a way to try to work towards something that always exceeds our grasp. And I never saw John do that. His piety was there, but when it came to talking about theology, he thought we could do it. And I mean, you guys know that critiques by evangelical Christians of process theology at Westmont College, John was presented as a heretic when I was there, and it was introduced by Stan Ovitz in some class. But when I brought those questions, a product of Westmont and Fuller, to John, I never heard him say, "Oh yeah, the gospel transcends Whitehead." Has anyone on the chat ever heard him say that?
I don't hear him use, he would more, he might say Abba, right? Like like he picks up, like in God and the World, he said, as a Christian, when I use the word God, I mean whatever God itself done in Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
And then at the end in his Abba book, he said, my when he begins, he says, my proposal in this book is to think about God as Jesus did. And in his critiques of mainline Protestantism, he tended to critique the fact that they became that their God sounded like one so far from the intimate vision you get in the Sermon on the Mount and these kinds of things, right? So that kind of divine, imminent intimacy with a aesthetic vision that moves towards mutual flourishing was intense.
So, Trip, let me push you. Let me push you on this. When you look at the Christology in Process and Reality, right, the comments about Jesus in Part 5,
Mm-hmm.
and then you consider the very gospel you were just describing, Sermon on the Mount, and the I ams in the Gospel of John. Don't you ever think, and this is what I always thought while I watched John defend a Whiteheadian Christianity, don't you ever think there's some gap there? There's some way in which we should say, like Wittgenstein at the end, when you've taken languages at the end of Tractatus, when you've taken language as far as it will go, you should let it set it aside, right? Set that ladder aside. Don't you ever think? I never heard John say, "Yeah, Whitehead can only take you so far."
Yeah, I mean, I think when he spoke theologically, he spoke unless so much of the boundary of his theology was what he thought he could talk about metaphysically. And and you could see the way the existentialist theologians early on in his career became the means by which early in his career his piety remained, right? Like the way he oriented his finitude was towards Abba, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that was always there. But by the time you get to Christ in a pluralistic age, then he picks back up his Christology, pushing back to the criticisms in that Encountering Jesus volume with the other faculty at CGU. Um, the he's asking the questions, Christological questions that the Logos asks, which are the ones that tend to be metaphysical in nature. The the speculation in it that I think is most uncomfortable for other process theologians that appreciate his pluralism, and the hinge point, if you want to say more, is when he talks about that Jesus's full faithfulness came that he came to internalize the primordial nature of God in the initial aim,
Mm-hmm.
and a kind of harmonic fidelity.
Yep.
So, like even in that passage I read earlier, Christ is the sinner and there is no boundaries. You can get to that kind of space, but they're all statements about the person of Jesus, and the work is the kingdom of God, which Jesus was connected to. But I mean, that was the area I said it. I thought he got closest, where his Christology in text got the furthest from Whitehead, because it's not like Whitehead postulates that as a possibility.
Right.
And when John read the chapter in my dissertation on it, he said, I did say all those things, and it's a bit uncomfortable to be put all right
Reminded
next
of
to
it.
each other. Yeah. Um, and, when he saw how it gets extended in the last chapter, he just said, well, I hope you're right. Which is John's version of going,
So
that's not where I'm going.
I want to get in at least one other hard question, and that's the question of the multiple ultimates. People who are as speculative as John Cobb was and David
Mhm.
Griffin often will push back against that. You can't have three different ultimates, three ultimate understandings of reality that are all true at the same time.
Yeah, but set it up some in case the
Yeah,
Christology stuff might be a little more familiar, but if people are just don't
yeah.
know multiple ultimates.
So when John is grappling in the early 1980s with the multiple religions, and especially with this Buddhist dialogue, which, by the way, that had been going on for about 20 years, and pretty much everybody who participated was frustrated and had pulled back. The Buddhists said, you Christians just don't get what we're talking about. Ours is a completely different understanding of reality. And the Christians said, likewise to them, you just don't get what we're talking about. It's a completely different understanding of reality. And that tension was sitting there. And now we had John Hick moving in his more liberal vein, About that time, he published this view that there's this ultimate real with a capital R, which nobody can know, and then we have just the aspects that we can know, but the real exceeds us. And we had exclusivism, inclusivism, and pluralism, and it was a radically relativistic pluralism, and that bothered John, right, as a Whiteheadian. And so he
And
began.
John Hick was on faculty with him at Claremont at this time.
Yeah, yeah. And so he began to struggle with it. I think that the conversations with Hick Hick was brilliant. I mean, if you ever heard him speak at the AR in his books, there was so much depth behind what he was saying. And I think he pushed John hard on that question. How can you not grant an ultimate pluralism or an ultimate understanding of a real that transcends all of our metaphysics, given radical pluralism around the world? And then John said, so, and this is in a dialogue with David Griffin, and then in a famous conference, which they published as a book, John had only a single chapter in this book that somebody else edited. And his was a deep religious pluralism, which meant that he affirmed all three of the different ultimate ways of understanding reality as the physical world, as the subjective God, and as the oneness of all. And these different, I mean, superficially science, Christianity, Buddhism, but it's much broader, more interesting than that. But how can a Whiteheadian, where there's such a clear metaphysic, endorse three apparently inconsistent, incompatible, ultimate views of the universe and say that all are true?
Do you think that it depends? Some people read this question of multiple ultimates as primarily in reference to metaphysical reality, so like world, God, creativity in Whitehead, and then that claim that's making a different kind of claim than those that read Whitehead more phenomenologically, and then the reference to those ultimates are function more as like experiential typologies, right? So like the experience of creativity, like would be experience of oneness, suchness, and such. God as like aesthetic, judgment, value, these kinds of things, and then the between, the participatory one, and the the in the metaphysical side, I thought the most fun thing that came out of it were all the people that became more friendly with process, because now there's something to critique to then figure out how to have a trinity again. So like Joseph Bracken's response to it is a real beautiful one, using the problem of the one and the many, the question of multiple ultimates, the Godhead and the Trinity to play it out. And then someone like John Tatominal picks up on the relationship of the phenomenological reading of them, and then talks and does a similar move of Bracken of taking the question of the one and the many, but of like phenomenology of religion, these different types of religious experience and wisdom, and brings it together. And both of them, I think, are signaling a recognition of what John's deep passion taking place, and going, I don't know if I can go there. But what he was so passionate about is that the particularity that is treasured in these different religious traditions and wisdom traditions has an integrity that can't be collapsed into either a mystery without referent, the real, or collapsed into one of them being correct. That there's something so particular about them that they all have to be treasured. And so the kind of
treasured is different. So Ben Cheka just said something really interesting in the chat. He said, God, world, creativity is cosmology, not ontology. So in a cosmology, you can have place for these three.
Mm-hmm.
But in an ontology, you have to bring them together into a single system. And we've watched, from the Greeks to the Neoplatonic tradition to medieval mystics to modern philosophers to Hegel, who's trying to tie it all together through a notion of the development, the real becoming rational. There's so many ways to really take on that problem. And for John just to say, no, we're just going to take Whitehead's God, world, creativity, and take each of those as symbolizing a huge family of metaphysical positions. And all three should be affirmed at the same time. That's a shocking claim. And to say, with that, I've answered John Hick's ultimate relativism. And I have now a and I think John would have said, a metaphysical system consistent that a Christian could affirm, that sees the ultimacy of the world, the ultimacy of the divine, and the ultimacy of this independent creative process. That's a hard question. I mean,
yeah,
we're
but
not
it
going to solve
was
that today. I want the difficulty of this question to really, weigh on us. Something John would
there's
have said.
something fun about it that because cosmology, I mean, for Whitehead, the religion's connection to cosmology is its own own thing, and then his so the like that whole pluralistic perspective of where someone has as an individual participates in a sense would be in different cosmologies, right? With if you have multiple religious belonging, that's kind of interesting. The
So go ahead, finish your thought.
Oh no, I was thinking of something that was tangentially related to this that popped in my head. Go
Yeah.
ahead.
So Pam says we are ever limited by language, and that seeing language as a limitation that somehow we have to move beyond, that makes a lot of sense to me. Or a piety or a sense of our immediate relationship with God, Abba, that makes sense to me. But to see all of the ultimates as contained in what we'd have to call a more ultimate system of the three, that is not a beyond language claim. When I was studying in Germany and I was surrounded by Hegelians, you go into a Hegelian class and the students would try to criticize this globally famous Hegelian, and he in those days would always say, here's how the system enters, and the students would get frustrated and say, there's no place to criticize the system because it's a take it or leave it. It's all there just as a single massive piece. If nothing's outside of it, then either you get converted into it or you stand outside and reject it, but there's no in between. Wouldn't that be the case if the three ultimates were true? That anything you say is already pulled in, aufgehoben, dragged into this entire system. That there's a tension there and it's said by a gentle guy that nobody can dislike, right? He's got this gentle smile and there's obviously no ego. But is it not a troubling position in some ways?
You know what? Here's the tangential thing I found funny. Also, that John Tatamano showed up in the chat right when he said
I
that.
know, I loved it.
I actually like
Thank you, John.
his. I like John's Talikian rejoinder to this question quite
Me too.
quite
Say it.
well.
Say what it is.
Oh no, that it kind of follows Chica's reference about the difference between cosmology and ontology, but John would say something like about Whitehead's right about like the nature of becoming and the way things work, but it's not right about like the relationship of God to the world of becoming. And there he has a much more Talikian sense. There's also this guy Phil Clayton in a book called The Problem of God in Modern Thought that does something similar with
Yeah,
Schelling.
actually, I do, John, and I know that there's some similarities in that. I find that more
I
satisfying in
was
some way.
joking, Phil.
And
I
I
was
know
giving a shout out to your book.
I got it, but
Okay.
I'm looking at John in the chat and saying, there's something similar, and Talikian might be the right word for it. There is something right about that willingness to take it in the direction of obviously of a symbolism that John would never say that. And it was fun to see what it meant for him to be able to walk into every room with that sort of calmness, because in some sense that makes him like a Hegel, a person, a thinker he didn't really like, but there was nothing that he bumped into that he wasn't able to place within that system as a whole. You remember the famous story of somebody walks into Hegel and say, you seem to have a place for everything, but here, what about Herr Kruger? Here at the table, he has this pen. What about Herr Kruger's pen? Where does that fit into your whole system? And anti-Hegelians would see, well, this is a good criticism of Hegel. But John, I never saw him ruffled about his Whiteheadian tri-ultimates view. Never worried about what that might leave out or warp in some way through that system.
Okay, so here's the one troubling bit. Then I want to let you answer Greg's question.
All right.
But it he was troubled, and it would come up when talking to Christians where when he would go, he would do essentially the multiple ultimates without all the metaphysical stuff, and then go, and that's why, I can be Buddhist, you know, and I can learn this because it's connected to
Yeah.
creativity. He has his philosophical reason, but he's doing it as how much benefit there is. And I think if people are interested in how it sounds in Christianese, his salvation book's the best. There's a difference between enlightenment and seeking enlightenment and salvation. One is about the transformation of this world towards beauty, goodness, truth, justice, these kinds of things. And the other is about disentangling ourselves from the ways our identity seized by something particular, and then you cherish it in wrong ways and blah, 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 suffering. So he gives us contrast, and he's like, Christians, there we have so much to learn. Isn't it cool that you're a disciple of Jesus and your Buddhist neighbor can teach you things? And we wouldn't have even known it if we weren't alive yet. This is so awesome. And then he goes, but the difficult thing for me is it is really hard to find Buddhists that think they have anything to learn from Christianity. And he goes, and it gets even harder when you tell them that you weren't even talking about the same thing. And then they go, okay. It was interesting. Like the moment he's talking to his own kind, you can hear him. That this theological idea that a lot of us might go, oh, I'm not sure about this or this or this. We know that he has invested so much time both in his practice, in contemplative practice, and in deep engagement with his Buddhist friends, that that he has like a experiential referent for what he's talking about. So his creativity, there's like more patience for it, and you're like, there's more going on here. But then the moment it gets inverted, he's like, but I haven't figured out what I do talking to a Buddhist if I go, well, these are different things. And they just kind of look at you, oh, well, that's nice.
Mm-hmm. So Greg says in the chat, the purpose of theology is not just to interpret the world, but to actively change it. Can you share some of the cool things Cobb did to change it? Especially interested in his work with or within China. I do want to talk about the China work because I worked with the Institute for the Postmodern Development of China for 20 years, and we often travel together in China. On the way there, though, I want to mention when Laudato Si came out. We just finished 5 years of work on a conference. We hosted 2,000 people in the big auditorium at Pomona College. We'd had 82 working groups. We'd founded new nonprofits. It's kind of an exhausted time where how old was John then? 87 or something like that? Must have been early 90s even. We would expect him to sit down and relax. But then on June 18th of 2015, Pope Francis released Laudato Si, the most powerful environmental statement by a pope ever. And John felt that it was transformative. And so he called us all in and said, well, we need to do a book immediately and get that out within 6 weeks. It actually took us 7 weeks. There were, I think, 46 chapters. I was asked to write the last one. There was a whole range of religions and sciences and ethical perspectives and data about the environment that John put together. And that book, For Our Common Home, I was just at a conference in Lille of Catholics talking about the 10 years since Laudato Si, and they mentioned that book as one of the really important contributions to move Laudato Si out of a Catholic world to the world as a whole. And that was John being an activist. He knew that the environmental crisis was of extreme importance. And even though he just pulled off a 2,000 person conference and paid for the whole thing, he needed now to jump in and to support the voice of Pope Francis, who needed our support to help the message be moved outside of and beyond Catholic circles as well. It was the same in China. John's personality fit in China in a way that's hard to describe. In that cultural context, he was perfect. He would be able to come. So you come to a meeting with one exception, not drinking, but we'll come to that. You come to a meeting and you're meeting with the president of a university or the head of one of the Communist Party schools, and you sit in these very formal chairs, two large ones at the front with a Chinese and American flag pointing in opposite directions. And then the others of us in the lower down the hierarchy will be down these chairs toward the back, right? And so John and the president of the university, or John and the vice president of China, will be sitting in the front, and somebody will make a comment in highly formal language, and the translator will whisper it in English into your ear, and then you'll have to John would make a response in English that'll be whispered in Chinese into the person's ear. It's diplomacy. It's complex. It's very Confucian, like a lot of respect. And John was flawless. I never saw him make a mistake at that. Then you go off and you give a lecture to some large audience, and John would stand up there and just in his calm, matter-of-fact way, never too theoretical, never too many isms. Isms don't exist in the Chinese language. He would present, these are the actions we need to take. I remember him speaking to 100 mayors of major cities in China about how we need to not tear down the villages and move everybody to the major cities. That as a policy of development in Western China would be a disaster for the environment. And his opinion took the day and became a policy of the Chinese government. And then, and this is the only part John didn't excel at, you go to the dinner and we'd sit countless times. John as a guest would be in the chair at the round table facing the door. And then he'd have on his, he'd be to the, on his right, he'd have the president of the university and on around. And you had to make a toast. Well, it's supposed to be a ganbei. So you hold up your, they call it white wine. It's kind of Chinese schnapps. And you give this toast to the whole room. John was good at the toast. Then you click glasses and you have to drink the thing and show that you drank it all. And as a non-drinker, John was having trouble having the Chinese understand how to do it. And then by the end, when everyone had 12 ganbeis and everyone said, now we're friends, let's work together. But they always looked at John like the guy hasn't done any ganbeis here. I don't know about this guy. But as an activist, incredibly effective. I mean, his birthday celebration, the last one for which he was alive, was done in a Chinese session with Zhehe Wang and Mei Jun Fan, the heads of the China project at the Center for Process Studies, organizing it. And thousands of people came on to wish John the best. In Chinese, he had become 100 when he turned 99 in the West. I don't know if that answers all of Greg's questions, but I want people to get some sense of how transformative he was across China. How many dissertations have been written in China on John Cobb's work as a Christian theologian?
Mm-hmm. One of the things I would say that has throughout his career, like from the time he turns to raising the ecological questions and writing the first eco theology, to then going to realizing that part of the problem isn't just the impact on the environment, that the system we're in is generating the problem. And if the economic system and its incentive structure and the demands for acceleration and accumulation and growth, if those don't change, there's no opting out to a different organization of life, right? And so that process vision then is what he and Herman Daly work on in their vision for the common good and a different model, economic model, and throughout this whole, and then like part of the China work is like, how do you even have cooperations of embodying different forms of values across whole different traditions and whole different economic and political regimes? So there's this like constant web of growth. And what's fascinating is that throughout his career, every time you get to another one of these moments, it gets regrounded in his own narrative to the kind of demands Jesus is making to his disciples. And the one that shows up in the three different books where he's looking at his own life, where it's either Confessions or one of the earlier ones, like on spiritual bankruptcy, about thinking about the church in career, or Confessions, his autobiography. And then what was the last one where he did it? It comes up in Abba. Is that in our own time, the Jesus demand to serve God or mammon is as real as it will ever be. It's just this time we don't have to debate the reality of hell. We're building it if we don't say yes to God. Yeah. And so when I think of you shared some of these macro things, the other element, and I don't know, well, you might know more, is he also even invested just like on the local government of Pomona, of what does it look like to think about relationships and flourishing even on this global level, from policy for China to what happens at a local level.
Mm-hmm. Or Progressive Christians Uniting, John Cobb, PCU.
Or just the life within Pilgrim Place.
Yeah, where he also took on some of the issues in that gentle way as well. As the EcoCiv, this organization that John encouraged us to found, began working next door in Pomona, where there's incredible poverty and unemployment. John loved nothing more than to hear the reports of what we were doing locally. This guy who's talking about bringing three ultimates together is really pleased that 5 miles from where he's sitting in Pilgrim Place, there's now an employment program. There's a program that's reducing violence on the streets. And as we were able to move the needle on those issues, John got genuine joy from that as well. From the Whiteheadian kindergarten, that's a great moment. On the northeast edge of Beijing is a Whiteheadian kindergarten built on the principles of Whitehead. There are now, I think, 12 or 13 of these in China. And John would go, there's some beautiful pictures of the little kids, like 3 and 4-year-olds and 5-year-olds, sort of sitting in his lap, and he's got his red Chinese robe on and is completely thrilled that Whitehead would be instantiated in this school of 40 or 50 little kids. That's an amazing John Cobb moment.
Yeah. Well, I can think of a lot more stories, but I'm sure we'll get more time to do it. And for those of you, I know there are some people who are already planning to go to his 100th birthday in February. Those same dates, there's going to be some kind of legacy celebration or something.
Saturday, February 16th, and it's already on Center for Process Studies. We'd already been planning a celebration of his 100th birthday, which would have been then. And now it will be a really amazing thinking of what John achieved, what were the impact of his work, what were the central principles of his work. And I really encourage you to come if you possibly can. I know that virtually everybody was deeply affected by John through the doctoral program. Catherine Keller and many others have already committed. That we've been writing back and forth about this. It should be an amazing, rich time. And it would be appropriate that John's work and person would bring together a massive group of us to commit to carrying on that work. Speaking of changing the world.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you, Phil.
Hey,
I've really enjoyed it. It's been nice to talk to you and also see so many names of familiar friends in the chat. If people have never got to listen to John, I had a very fun interview with him on his 97th birthday. That's on the pod. And that links to like another 14 interviews or so. So there's lots of them. But on his 97th birthday, it was very retrospective, and he cut to the chase on quite a few answers that were rather entertaining. So,
all right, hey, Trip, let's keep the conversation going and see if we can carry on John's work.
all righty.